Hey everyone, we've been trying to figure out whether people like breakout rooms, because sometimes I see really positive feedback and other times I see sort of negative feedback. And this time, since I explicitly said in Slack for those who saw it, like you could join in halfway in between, maybe this is our measure of how many people are in each camp. But hopefully everyone here actively finds breakout rooms valuable. Got a thumbs up. I also need to find a way to tile the video so that I can see how many thumbs up I'm getting. Oh, there we go. All right. All right. It's three past. I think everyone has seen the prompt in Slack. I think that makes sense, but just to give it another 1 minute voiceover, there are many ways you could create synthetic data. And if you have a good theory as to what makes for a good match between a query and your desired response, then you can make good synthetic data to fine tune on. And then Jason gave that example of one person says, I like coffee, one person says, I hate coffee. And in some embedding space, how far apart should those be? Well, it depends on, in reality, for your specific product, do those people tend to get along and match well, or do they match poorly? And that depends on the circumstance. This is somewhere where we are starting to get closer to the conventional machine learning of we're going to observe from behavior, and then we don't exactly know what the rule is for how it all fits together, but we're going to learn that. And then it's going to be very customized or specific to exactly your situation. Being able to do that on an ongoing basis is a big ongoing competitive advantage. You're going to have a system that just keeps improving over time. And even if someone else started a similar service with all the same prompts, if they don't have the same data flywheel, their service wouldn't be as good as yours. But it all relies on identifying what are the behaviors that you want to instrument for or observe that you can then subsequently use in building your fine-tuned re-rank or embedding model. So question is, for the problem you're working on, or if you don't have a problem you're working on, I want you to spend a moment thinking about what a project is that you hope to work on in the near future, and then think about what are the behaviors that you want to instrument for or capture that could then be part of that data flywheel so that you can repeatedly build a better model, deliver a better experience, get more users, collect more data, deliver a better experience, and so on. So with that, I will give you guys a minute to ask questions if anyone wants to ask questions. And then if not, I will kick off the breakout rooms. All right. I'll see you guys in a few minutes. Sudhir, do you want me to put you in a breakout room or do you want to just wait? We got
Yeah,
a
sorry, I'm late. If you could just throw me in any random breakout room, that'd be great.
perfect. Awesome.
Something with amateurs.
I think everyone else is going to pile in the next 20 seconds, but you can.
Oh, okay, yeah, because I was like, oh, I saw only okay people.
And since we may have people, yeah, just do quick summaries.
I think we were room one with Jay and Divesh. In the end, we're discussing like how we can, what part of the workflow can we log and use as as capturing the actual usage of the results. Is user retrying the same query, similar queries in the same session? Do you suggest other queries and are they using and following that? And for example, in my case, the client even wants to know if somebody copy pasted, copied one of the answer text, and they even want to know if he pasted back in the system somewhere else. It's a closed system. It would be possible to detect that. So we're kind of looking at things like that. Some of the usage of our application are more transactional. If you sell it, you set something, you find it, you buy it, you order it, it's okay. That was fine. If you sell something else, maybe you can use that as a signal. But it's basically, what we could try to detect that the user is struggling in doing something, but you don't have quite clear indicators that no specific query was what he wanted, unless he follows up a specific workflow or it's somehow using the result. So that was basically the discussion we had around.
Yeah, I think copy paste, depending on the circumstance, copy paste button, you can't really control what they paste, but having the copy button, it's a nice feedback mechanism that you can monitor. Cool. We got room two, Darren, Dylan, Florian, and Seamus.
Yeah, I'll take this up. So a lot of the confusion was well, first of all, how to even like approach fine tuning or like re-ranker, because it's not something common. You first have to grab all the data, and I was a bit unsure on what's the main approaches. Like, when would you want to fine tune the like re-ranker instead of maybe just focusing on fine tuning the embedding model as much as possible? When is like the most benefit? And then the second one was like, how do you, when you got your users' data, how do you actually separate it and actually focus on what is the key aspects of that data to fine tune for the re-ranker? So we went through a lot of different case scenarios. One of the members was talking about how he was looking at for a baseball team to re-rank what he was calling power. So he was linking different attributes to it, and it was actually not classifying certain power attributes which should be included in the re-ranker, and then he was training it for that to get better results. But I think a lot of it was just confusion on what points to focus on to fine-tune a re-ranker. It was a bit unclear. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there are. I'll respond quickly, and Jason may as well, and then we'll go to the next room after that. I think there are a few things you said there. So one is sort of when we collect the data to fine tune a re-ranker, if we're going to do that, what's the data that we collect? So it's pairs of what's the request that we want to send to the model, and what do we want to have be first, second, third, and that's obviously very domain specific. You could see you could see what works in the hardware store example might be totally irrelevant to how you would do it in some legal product. In terms of what is higher value to fine tune, if you are using a re-ranker, then the embedding model frequently is just picking what are the top 50 or so chunks. And that's a place where you can cast a wide enough net that I think the ROI on fine tuning the re-ranker is going to be greater than the embedding model. If you said we're so concerned about latency or cost that we're not going to use a re-ranker, well, now you've only got one layer and it's obviously much easier. But my view, which actually is on a project getting a little bit validated just in the last couple of days, is that fine tuning the re-ranker, if you can figure out what the right data is the higher ROI. These two. I don't know if Jason, if you have something to add.
No, I generally agree in the sense that if your goal is to improve retrieval as much as possible in the near term, first understanding what good retrieval looks like. Like if we have the synthetic data, we have these sort of binary labels. If we use a language model to score things, we can get some relevance labels. Fine-tuning the re-ranker is going to be the easiest thing, right? You're going to take maybe 500 milliseconds of additional latency, but you're probably going to see like 5 to 10% improvements in sort of your baseline recall. The only time I would think fine-tuning your embedding models would make sense is if you have much more data. If you have thousands or tens of thousands of examples of good queries and chunks, or maybe you have thousands of examples of queries to like tool retrieval, if you have multiple different tasks where you have this kind of relevancy data, then it might make sense to think about fine-tuning an embedding model, right? Because now your embedding model cannot only compare whether a question and a chunk is similar, it's going to be able to compare whether a question and a tool is similar. And what that actually ends up meaning is that the embeddings for multiple questions you have baked in some of the knowledge of what data is going to be retrieved, and has baked in some knowledge of what kind of tools it needs or what kind of SQL snippets and whatnot. And if you go back into week 2, where we think about this clustering and topic modeling, in the beginning, this topic modeling doesn't really make any sense because we're saying, okay, 2 questions are similar if OpenAI tells us they're similar. Well, what does that mean? But if you have an embedding model that you fine tune, now 2 questions are similar if they need the same tables, they use the same tools, they retrieve the same data. And so that clustering task also becomes a lot easier. So it's also very useful in your data analysis. But you only need to do data analysis if you have tons of data. And so I think most people are probably not there yet, but the data you collect now will still give you some progress. But I would say like the embedding is something that I think about on like a multiple month-long timescale, whereas re-rankers is kind of like a week-long project for some people on the team.
So do you only use the data that you classify from the user's input, or do you also classify what it's being retrieved and what the results being sent back by your original re-ranker? Like, are you just logging all of that out? I'm just trying to understand like the best processes for collecting data. Sorry, I'm asking more questions. I know you guys need to go to other groups.
No,
Yeah.
this is great.
It really depends on what can I afford to do. So if one goal, and I'll talk about this more in next week, where we think about like how do you design UIs to collect more data. But generally, I would say if you have any signal, maybe people can star things, right? Like, okay, if someone stars things, let's assume right now that like everything that is cited is relevant, right? And if they don't star it, maybe it's irrelevant. If I can't afford to give them this like star, thumbs up, thumbs down feedback, maybe the only difference is all the chunks that the language model cites is relevant and all the chunks I don't cite. Maybe I'll randomly pick one. I'll treat that as a hard negative or something like that. But you can also imagine a situation where, like, if you think of Facebook's people you may know UI, right? It kind of shows you 5 profiles, but it doesn't let you scroll, right? So the only way to see another recommendation is to X one out. And so what that means is if I show you 5 things and you want to see a 6th thing, I have to force you to delete something. That becomes a hard negative that I can use to improve my model. Whereas if I show you 20 people and you scroll around, you add 1 person, I only get 1 positive. So now you're thinking about how do we design the interactions to collect that data. But that's something I'll talk a lot more about next week. But there's a lot of like games you can play in the UX to collect more data.
Oh, perfect. Appreciate it. Mhm.
Yeah, if you send me your example too, I'm happy to jam on Slack.
I'm not that far along. This is still new for me, but yeah, appreciate
No
it.
worries, no worries. Group 3?
So that'd be
If I can jump
Ad-
in here.
Adam, Dan, Kenji.
We talked a lot about sort of what is the threshold, and that would be a helpful thing. Is like, we're all fairly early in the process, so like establishing a data flywheel and all the other things we're talking about is a little bit more of a future prospect. It'd be great to have a sort of generalized understanding. I know it's case by case, but like, what's the level of impact in sort of the full pipeline of the different stages? Like, say you were talking about fine-tuning embedding versus fine-tuning the re-ranker. And then for me, it was important to really focus on chunking and cleaning the text. It'd be great to have like an understanding of like, what are the levers to tune at different stages in the process? Like, say you're early, what's the most important thing to focus on? Cleaning the data, synthetic data, and then fine tuning, or what's the threshold for these different things?
So if I was to come onto a project and say, okay, let's go figure out like what do we need to improve? The first thing again is basically all this week 1 content, right? I need to see some kind of recall at K metric for your embedding search. And what I would basically want to look at is, okay, what is recall at 5, 50, 7,500? And so the first question is, okay, in my embedding search, do I even have a shot in finding the right information? Because if you told me recall at 100 was 80%, but recall at 5 was 40%, okay, what does this say? Well, it means that the embedding is working, but there's no way I can bring the good results higher up. And then the second constraint might be, Jason, I can't afford to put 75 text chunks. Okay, if that's the case, and I know that recall at 75 is very good, maybe the answer becomes, let me recall 75 text chunks and pass them into Cohere's re-ranker. Given that, what does the recall at K look like? Okay, now so the embedding model had recall at 75 be 90%. After the re-ranker, to get 95% recall, I get to choose 20 things, right? So it's like, okay, recall at 20 with the re-ranker is as good as recall with 75. Okay, it's gonna add 500 more milliseconds of latency. Can I afford it? Probably, because the context window is so much shorter, it's fine, right? But maybe you realize that, okay, recall at 25 is still not good enough because we can't afford to put this in because we're actually doing like super large chunks. Okay, what can we do to make that better? We can do 2 things, right? We can either play around with the recall of the embedding model or the recall of the re-ranker. And generally for me, fine-tuning the re-ranker is going to be a little bit easier because I'm going to have fewer data and I'm going to be able to have more relevancy. I really just look at like, what is the recall at K across multiple Ks of the embedding model? What are the recalls at K for the re-ranker, and tune those knobs such that it makes sense, right? Because maybe 75 documents just takes too much latency for the re-ranker to re-rank. Like, man, I can only afford to pass in 45 documents into the re-ranker before I hit like a 1 second latency hit. That would mean I need a cosine distance model.
It's also more of a, and maybe this is sort of a domain or company type of thing. So from the startup side, it's like trying to pathfind the next highest leverage point of work.
Yeah.
Like we done fine-tuning a re-ranker in the past, and then because we're not like out in the world, we're still developing, we're still building features, we're still like changing things. And so the types of things we might actually be re-ranking fundamentally change.
Yeah.
So it's almost that like we've put that off now as a point of procedure internally because, okay, well, we're not even sure what we're going to be feeding the re-ranker in some sense. So it's more like procedurally, what steps make the most sense as you're pathfinding towards a product that you'd be deploying. And in our case, we found that like re-ranking goes or fine tuning in all cases kind of goes last. Like we have a rig set up to do it, but because models continue to iterate as we develop, it's also like we're changing and swapping out tooling along the way.
Yeah, I think that's where the segmentation comes in, right? It's okay, do we have any user data that tells us what people are asking? But that kind of goes back to like the week 1 and the week 2 work, where in the construction example, it's like, oh man, like we really just need to be way better at searching contracts. Like 30% of our queries are contract search queries, and the people asking these questions are the general contractors. They're super important to our customer base. So we want to make sure we serve that segment well. And I can justify serving that segment well because we have like 50% recall for these contracts. We know they're super important and they're 30% of our query usage. And it's kind of like the data I present to the team, whether like the VP of product, and goes, I think we need to spend the next 3 weeks improving our ability to do contract search. This is going to improve 30% of our usage base. These are our most important customers based on the demographics. And this is the worst performing thing. And then it becomes, okay, well, what are the tools do I need? What kind of capabilities can I build to do that better? Can I build the routers? Okay, now I have all these evals for this contract thing. Let me now fine tune a model that can understand contracts a little bit better. Do you think there's something that's like stopping you from being able to do this kind of segmentation work or data analysis to uncover these?
Oh no, we definitely go down that route. It's more like we've kind of just avoided the fine tuning side because things change rapidly, and when we alter how routing works and something just like small like that, all of a sudden the re-ranker is faced with a different and so it feels like a more of like a okay, once I have this in front of like thousands of people and like I'm running it, then cool, we can improve and get that last mile 5% improvement or whatever else. And it might actually be larger than that. And I guess that was sort of the original query is like, if you were to put like I mean, this is sort of an impossible task, but like level of importance, like 10% on fine tuning for your re-ranker and sanitizing the data with chunking and then segmentation, what would be sort of the level of importance so that we can, I guess, pathfind more effectively in development?
Yeah, I mean, I think re-ranking, fine-tuning, that kind of stuff, that's the stuff that gets you maybe like a 5-10% improvement in your recall. Really, the bulk of your improvements are the new capabilities you develop, right? It's like the DoorDash example where there's just like no Greek restaurants. If you just sign up more Greek restaurants, you'd solve that problem. It's not really an AI problem. And that's almost like it either doesn't work or you can make some simplifying assumptions that allows you to build a search index that does make it work. And then the only thing you can figure out is, okay, the numbers you're looking at isn't whether or not it's going to work like 2% better or 5% better. It's going to be whether it works at all. And then if you go back to the segmentation, it's going to be, well, what percentage of the population could benefit from this working at all, right? So I would still really push towards basically looking at the segments first and using that to justify new capabilities, right? And if you build a new capability and it's like 80% and you wish it was 90%, that's where you can think of like the fine-tuning step. But anyway, the bulk of the work is really figuring out, at least in the construction example, figuring out that we were really underserving our ability to understand contracts. It was less of the abstraction layer of like we needed to chunk things better, and it was less of a layer like we need to re-rank contracts better. But it was just, people are asking about like sign state. We had that is the work to be done.
Yeah, we're just like, we don't say you're pre-users, right? We're not segmenting user queries. We're just sort of, I mean, we tried to do this funny thing and it was kind of amusing. We made fake users with an LLM, just like, you're this demographic and this is a tool. What kind of questions would you ask? And like tried some things like that to just generate a fake data set of like fake users and user queries. But it seems so ungrounded that like it was hard to say like, okay, this is worth, okay, the LLM thinks this is a good use case, so we should build that.
Yeah, but that's just, again, those are kind of things that you have to sort of figure out through more user, like most of those answers do not come from like data analysis.
Right. So what you're saying is I should get users?
Get users, talk to people,
okay.
Talk to customers.
I'll work on that.
Figure out who you need to talk to get people in the conversation. Let's jump into group 3.
Group 4, that is Alex, Manikandan, and Will.
Great, great. Okay. Yeah, so I can summarize some of the things we discussed. The first thing is we don't call it fake, Kenji, we call it synthetic. You're almost making it sound bad. Yeah, so one of the challenges if you create fake queries is you want to know that the query has the matching chunk. So of course you can go on GPT and give it a chunk and say, okay, come up with a question so that the answer is contained there, but usually you get things out of distribution or not matching the real questions. So one of the challenges we discussed is, I guess if you have a seed of real questions, you can use the seed in the prompting. And there's a whole sequence of more sophisticated algorithms where you evolve there's evolve instruct, self-instruct, there's methods where you can improve the synthetic data set. I don't know how much that works well. It was unclear to us. Another thing he said is for real feedback, all our experiences has been users don't give you feedback much. And if they give you feedback, it's only when they're really upset or when it's really, even when you get feedback, it's from a corner case of situations that's probably not typical ones. So one idea in Mani's case, I think, and in some cases, you just naturally have a search. So people are clicking on something, and when people are clicking on something, you collect the feedback from the natural workflow. So I guess one thing that we got as a message is you have to somehow get feedback from your natural workflow and not hope that they will click. And I guess what Jason said with this very clever idea of, oh, I really want to see who viewed my profile, but now I'm going to only see it if I delete some of the people I may know. Forcing the workflow to make the user give me feedback is, I think, a very clever insight there. And then I guess the other things we discussed is, okay, sometimes search will benefit by adding metadata, which we know. And we didn't know if fine-tuning re-rankers was something that I don't have experience on fine-tuning rankers, and it sounded like a more advanced thing to do. But I guess it depends on, as Jason has explained, it depends on the use case. But yeah, that's kind of what we got from our conversation.
Yeah, I think fine-tuning re-rankers, like using Cohere's re-rankers, it should actually feel like fairly straightforward, right? Because a lot of it is just having even 100 or 1,000 good examples is probably going to be enough to give you that like 5% boost. I think the nuance really comes into fine-tuning embedding models, but I think that's because that's my background. I'm probably more a little bit biased towards sort of thinking a lot about those situations. Because again, it's like usually when you fine-tune these embedding models, it's not just to make the product better, it's to make your data analysis a lot easier too, right? Because like the Spotify Discover Weekly is like, okay, songs are related if they're in the same playlist, if they're listened to by the same people, or they're from the same album, they have the same like BPM, and you have all this information. And that's how you make like the Spotify recommendations really, really good versus just having some kind of like user ID, song ID re-ranker. That's usually not enough to get really, really good results.
I'd add a couple of things. So one is, so Jason gave an example of you need to click an X to see the next person. So that would be how to get hard negatives. I think getting positive examples is much easier. So earlier we talked about maybe you've got a button that copies something to the clipboard if you're presenting data that you expect people to put in some other document. So if you've got a mechanism like that on the front end, that's actually like there are many cases where you'd find something that is a proactive measure of taking some action and that implicit feedback. You can fine tune just on the positive examples. And then like Jason said, I think using the Cohere fine tuning once you have the data is pretty straightforward.
And to add to that too, like a lot of good data science and machine learning is done through good product design, right? And so part of it, like a part of the work is making sure we have the good feedback, right? It's almost like if you're building an assembly line, like you have to make a job that says like someone's job is to take products out of the assembly line and then test them, right? We can't just sort of wait until there's a massive recall for us to realize something's going on. Like for example, with Zapier, we used to have a very small thumbs up, thumbs down button in the top left corner of the screen. And we just said, like, we need more feedback. And what we did, we just moved it right above the enter button. Like at any given point, like just the feedback mechanism is just a larger percentage of the screen. And you change the colors, you change the copy. We'll like send you an email afterwards to ask you if you're satisfied, right? It's like existing systems like customer support, for example. Like every customer support conversation, they send you an email like 20 minutes afterwards. It's like, here's the transcript. Were you happy with the results? that's them like begging and like pleading with the user to get that feedback. And so I think it's really important to also really understand that a lot of the improvements are external to the system, right? Like it is kind of goofy to be like, oh, I think the answer is to like get more users. But I think the real conversation there would be, how can we make a simpler product to get in front of users more quickly? Like we might want to have this like massive dream to be able to produce something, but can we actually build something that's like 6 times simpler just to like understand what kind of questions people are asked? And can we build other incentives to get more data, get more labels, et cetera, et cetera? Was that the last group, Dan? I think so, right?
No, we got one more. Group 5, Sudhir and Vaibhav. I think Sudhir joined late. I think someone else was originally in that room who's left.
Yeah, I joined late, but I think the question or the topic discussed was reducing latency retrieval in an agentic workflow. So I haven't actually had this problem yet because I haven't had a use case for that yet with such a complex workload. But I figured, especially having UI, so you have some shimmer or coding component, you tell the user what the agentic steps are being processed, just like Perplexity does. It's searching trends for XYZ, what it's actually doing, and also caching the frequently used data responses, and then you just retrieve that instead of actually processing it.
Definitely makes sense. Yeah, I'll talk more about this in next week's, like the last session, which will mostly just be around like how we think about product. And a lot of it is just like making sure we have interstitials, having user interfaces, making sure things are interruptible, even just stopping for a second to ask for permission, I think is a great way of sort of, again, making things feel good. Because like it's less about how long something takes and almost more about like how well does the system communicate to the user, right? If you think of having an intern or an assistant, a task might take a day, but if they don't send you a single update, you just become like impatient and nervous. And so it's a lot of like how we can do that. But also setting up situations where if we're using like multiple tools and parallel tools, we can also render the tools in a way that is streaming. So not only do we render a response, we can also stream out status updates about not only the tool creation and the tool execution. Those things are all going to make that latency feel a lot better. I know we're almost at time. I might have like time for maybe 10 minutes of questions, and then I get the first meal of the day in. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and then we can jump into the studio.
Yeah, just following on that question about the UX, is there any preferred UI, or do you just handle custom React components for things like displaying insights into the mind of the agent, just like Perplexity does?
Yeah, everything I've seen has mostly just been like most of what I've seen and built have been either React apps or through texting, right? They all or like a Slack bot. And most of what has been done over React is just like server-side events or webhooks. But I think server-side events is a little bit easier to build out in Python. Almost everyone I know has built like very custom components. I don't know if there's like a really good like interstitial library that is in JavaScript or anything like that. A lot of it is just like streaming JSON out from the backend and then just making sure we have a good way of rendering that. What kind of tools are you thinking about using?
Well, I currently have a prototyping radio, but at this point, when I try to add a new feature, like having it's almost unusable because you're not getting the audiogram response as it's talking to the user as a person. And then you have to actually send, and the error handling is not there. So at this point, I just need to start building my own components with Next.js. That's probably UI use Python. But there's so many components, libraries.
Yeah, everything I've done is just like using React hooks and like use state. Darren makes a good call out. The Vercel SDK for LLMs is pretty good. So if you're on like the React Vercel stack, they have a lot of really good like partial streaming JSON capabilities. But I'll give like way more like visual, like the examples I'll give next week are going to be all like very visual. So you kind of get a sense of like the before and after of improving some of these systems.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Anyone else have any questions? Cool. If that is the case, we can wrap up on time. And then, yeah, we'll see you tomorrow. And then next week will be the last one. We'll mostly talk about UI design and how to sort of coerce feedback from the user. It'll be useful for everyone. Awesome. Take care, everyone.